Chapter 4. Over the next several months, Amon felt the demon's hold on his heart lessening all the time. He threw himself into his work at the warehouse completely, and was rewarded with a small string of successes in his sales in Ur, as well as the small local caravans headed up by Ishtub-Sin. Iltani eventually assented to Amon hiring a cook and a housekeeper so that she could focus completely on Sarah. She was gratified that Amon allowed her to select whom he would hire, and she chose women that were as innocuous and as quiet as she herself had become. Another source of growing importance in shaking loose the demon's grip was the debate group Ira had invited him to attend. Meeting with Ira's group was an ever more liberating experience for Amon, despite Enmor's continued opposition to his presence and the odd personal quirks of several members. Amon had long honed his wit by practicing sarcastic remarks and quick insults. His mother had ever delighted in his quick tongue and clever mind. In this new group, however, a well-reasoned response, a solidly supported idea, and a wide-ranging knowledge of the world were most appreciated. Amon was smart and could easily accompany the reasoning of the best of them, but he was not well practiced in logic, and he had difficulty in developing arguments that the others could not quickly and easily puncture. The verbal fencing, the quick give and take, allowed him to turn his mind away from the brooding clouds in his heart and focus on other things. By far, the dominant personality of the group was Dagon, Ira's mentor and senior scribe who worked in the palace and advised the king directly. Dagon seemed inordinately preoccupied with taxation and agricultural production, but Amon supposed that his position as a scribe gave him a skewed view of the world as it related to such matters. Dagon projected an air of wisdom that permeated everything. He had perfect elocution, a wide-ranging vocabulary, and a perfect mastery of both the Sumerian and Akkadian tongues. Dagon was by far the oldest member of the group, and though his hair at the temples and his beard both had more grey than black, he was as active and energetic as even the youngest member of the group. It was Dagon's way to sit back and let the debate develop. Each of the members of the group was given a chance to state his opinion by drawing lots, then Dagon would summarize and pronounce his own view. Once Dagon had his say, the topic was closed, for none of the group members had ever successfully gainsaid Dagon, and those who had tried had each been so thoroughly put in his place that he would not care to repeat the experience anytime soon. When Amon came to the first discussion, the topic had been the efficacy or impotence of the gods. Amon had remained mostly silent as he tried to get a feel for the protocol of the discussion. Dagon's pronouncement had been that while the gods might occasionally intervene in human affairs, for the most part they seemed to be content to merely sit back and watch, or at most to merely set the path of the greater events but leave the details to sort themselves out. After that, there had been debates about the chaotic political situation in Eridu, the emperor's taxation policies, the recent increase in exports from Ur to points east and west along the coast, and the relative benefits and drawbacks of planting farms in the annual flood zone of the Euphrates. Amon had gradually been drawn deeper and deeper into the debates until he participated as fiercely as anyone. His greatest foe so far, other than his own inexperience, had been an Akkadian by the name of Abram. Abram had a long, horsey face and a long, full beard. He was fond of wearing desert garb more fitting on a shepherd than a city dweller. He was somewhat of an oddity in the debates, relying primarily on appeals to the authority of ancient writings to make his points. He was prone to pontificate with frequent references to the proverbs of barbarian northern prophets. Amon didn't know who had first invited Abram, but it seemed that he was universally despised among the handful of regulars. The makeup of the group changed week by week, but Abram, Ira, Enmor, as well as Dagon and some of the others never missed a meeting. Amon, who had ever trusted his own conclusions far more than some supposed prophet who was long dead, was a perfect nemesis for Abram. When Dagon announced the latest topic, is the word of the gods the ultimate moral authority, or is there a law greater than the gods? And the lots were drawn, Amon was to follow Abram. Amon's mind began spinning furiously. He vowed to himself that he would humiliate Abram. Enmor, who had drawn the first lot, gave only a very basic discussion and his points were pedestrian, but by the time the lot reached Abram, the argument had been well developed. Amon was gratified to see Abram take a precarious position supporting a combination of both sides of the argument. Abram began by explaining that all the gods were really subservient to just a single god. Each of the lesser gods has limited authority over one or a few domains, and so their pronouncements and authority cannot extend beyond the domain that they control. Enki controls the waters, Enlil the winds, and so on. None of these gods has authority over all creation. Who exactly are these lesser gods you refer to? Amon asked. It was technically a breach of protocol for a member who had yet to speak to question the one currently discoursing, but asking for definitions of unclear terms was encouraged, so no one objected. The lesser gods are all the gods who must yield to the one who holds dominion over the rest, Abram explained briefly. So An is the only true god? Amon persisted. Abram grew irritable. Anu is a lesser god, like the rest, he said, preferring the Akkadian name over the Sumerian one. The one true god to whom all the rest must yield is the Lord of Light. Amon was confused. Who is the Lord of Light? He asked. Several of those at the table groaned. Apparently Amon had just given Abram a treasured opening to extol the virtues of his god. You Sumerians have a god for every occasion and for everything which is dangerous or useful. You multiply gods as you multiply words. The true god, however, has the attributes of many of your Sumerian gods, and he claims dominion over all of them. For instance, you worship Nana, the god of the full moon, and Enzu, the god of the crescent moon, and Shamash, the god of the sun, and many other gods besides. All of these false gods are but one aspect of the one true god, the Lord of Light. The Lord of Light has all of the masculine power of Lord Wild Bull, the crescent moon, and it is he who controls the fertility of man, animal, and plant alike. He is the god that dies and lives again, just as Enzu disappears from the sky bit by bit as he is overcome by darkness, but he returns to blaze brightly in his full glory as Nana, the full moon. It is his glory that shines so brightly in the sun, and through that power he grants the warmth and light of the sun and of fire to the earth. Yes, Enmul interrupted rudely. The Lord of Light is grand and powerful and contains all the attributes of the other gods, blah blah blah. We understand already. Amon smiled inwardly. For Abram to take the position of a religious zealot rather than an objective observer seemed like a huge gaffe. Abram continued. The Lord of Light himself, like Shamash, is the god of correct behavior and of rules. He upholds the principles of righteousness and eschews evil. He follows all of his own decrees, else he would lose his position as the perfect god. Please explain what you mean, Dagon requested. The Lord of Light gives decrees to the earth, and in each of these decrees he is the exemplar. He fulfills the decrees perfectly, and so shows us, mere mortals, how these things are to be carried out. As an example, take the law of sacrifice. The Lord of Light is the god that dies and rises again, and thus he shows us that he is willing to sacrifice all, even his own life, to fulfill the law. Amon frowned. Arguing such a complex and esoteric theory seemed to be an even greater mistake than Abram's previous gaffe. Abram seemed very much out of form today. Itana, will you support or rebuke Abram's position? Dagon prompted. I choose to rebuke, Amon said. In the first place, it is well known by all that the patron god of a city has the prosperity of that city in his power, independent of whatever domain the god controls. Do the people of Uruk sacrifice to Inanna only because they desire to find love or success in war? Of course not. They sacrifice to Inanna because if they fail to do so, she will cease to protect them and Uruk would fall to its enemies. Whatever individual domains Abram is talking about for each god, he fails to take into account that our peace and prosperity depend on propitiating the patron god of the city. If it were not so, then why would the people of each city spend so much of their grain, fruits, and animals in sacrifice? Would it not be an absurd waste of their resources if it were not absolutely necessary for their well-being? Well reasoned, Dagon opined. The two simple words of rare praise gave Amon a warm glow. Amon was tempted to expound further, but he had observed that those who took up too much time with their explanations often annoyed their audience and gained no greater favor, so he passed the word to Ira, who, to Amon's surprise, first attacked Amon and then took up Abram's argument. Friend Abram clearly sees that the lesser gods have limited power, and that to obey them or disobey them carries only the risk of receiving a punishment in that specific god's domain, Ira continued. If I flaunt Enki's will and then go for a voyage on the Great River, I may expect that the wrath of the god of the deep waters may follow me. If I avoid Enki's domain, however, I have nothing to fear from him. As Enmul said, the gods are like noble barons who must obey the will of their master and ultimately submit themselves. Itana tried to get Abram to clarify who the great god is. Itana thought that it must be An, but Abram chose the Lord of Light instead. Ira paused then to look around the table at his audience, ensuring that he captured their attention in order to emphasize his next point. Neither An, nor Shamash, nor the Lord of Light is the great god. For as Abram so correctly pointed out, the Lord of Light is bound by the very rules he chooses to enforce. For otherwise, how could the God of laws be deserving of any worship if he himself follows not the laws he has decreed? It is as if a judge who had executed 1,000 men for murder were to himself kill a man who cheated him at dice. Abram is fond of quoting from the ancient texts, and I think that this approach is most appropriate here. Ira, the least pious man at the table, then proceeded to shock them all by recounting the first lines of the story of creation. When the sky was not yet named, and the earth beneath did not yet bear a name, and the primeval Abzu, who begat them, and Chaos Tiamat, the mother of them both, their waters were mingled together, and no field was formed, no marsh was to be seen, when of the gods none had been called into being. Ira trailed off, and once again looked around the table. "Do you not see the obvious conclusion?" he asked. "Who existed before all of the gods and was responsible for their creation? Who will continue to exist after the gods are gone and will have full dominion over the earth and all things created? It is Tiamat, the primordial chaos, who some call Thalate and others Ahriman. The Lord of Light is Ahriman's brother, but at every turning of the moon we all see that the darkness is greater than the light, for even the very Lord of Light is overcome by the darkness. Who among you has not noticed that Nana's mighty lamp at its brightest only causes ever darker shadows to be cast? While the Lord of Light has 1,000 decrees by which he is bound, Ahriman has none. Therefore, of the two, Ahriman, the unbound, must be the more powerful." Ira sat back and steepled his hands on his chest, grinning in his certainty that he had made the telling point in the entire argument. Amon was stunned. He had first heard the term Thalate, the temple in Uruk, when Tirigan, a minion of the powerful matron of the temple, had tested Amon's reaction to the term. Amon had known nothing about it then, and still knew nothing about it now, other than it was a term used by a cult of religious zealots who sought to overthrow the traditional order of the gods and establish a new order based on the worship of chaos. Amon looked around the table. There were 2 or 3 shocked expressions similar to his own, but for the most part, the participants in the discussion recognized the term and were unsurprised by Ira's argument. If anyone at the table was more shocked than Amon, it was Abram. He appeared as if he were about to have an apoplexy. "To elevate chaos to the position of governing power in the universe is blasphemy! Blasphemy!" Abram raged. "It is tantamount to saying that all men must die, and therefore we ought to worship death. Chaos is the destruction and dissolution of everything. To worship chaos is to take joy in the end of all things." Abram was wild-eyed and red-faced in his anger, but Amon thought he made a pretty good point. Dagon held up a hand, and all eyes turned to him. "Abram is correct that to worship chaos is a dangerous path. However, Ira's argument that chaos is the ultimate power is also correct. Therefore, we must conclude that, just as a fire is a powerful tool which must be controlled and respected, lest the wielder be burned, so too is chaos a great power which must be respected and, yes, controlled, if the wielder is not to be destroyed." After Dagon's pronouncement, the group broke up into smaller collections of 2 or 3 people and began to disperse. Amon left the tavern and began to make his way back home, but he was accosted by Abram just outside the door. "Itana, surely you see that the course these fools propose is madness," Abram said. "I did not hear them propose any course," Amon countered irritably. "They were just speaking in theoretical terms about complex theology. I am sure they do not mean to do anything rash." Abram shook his head. "You heard Dagon. He said that chaos can be channeled and controlled, used as a tool. That is a course of action, and it is a foolish one." Amon was annoyed to hear Abram, whom he very much disliked, giving voice to his own worries about what his friends believed. "They mean nothing more by it than when they say that lapis lazuli from the Hind is a better item for trade than tortoiseshell. They will not act on these things, they are only thoughts," Amon said. Abram snorted. "I hope you are right, young Itana. Serving the god of chaos and destruction has consequences that I suppose these hotheads have never considered." With a flourish of his outlandish desert robe, Abram turned and strode away. Amon shook his head and walked once again toward home. Abram was more of a zealot than he had expected, but apparently so were most of the rest of them. He was very troubled by what he had heard this afternoon. Might there indeed be some link between his group of new friends and the coups which had occurred in both Eridu and Uruk? And if there were, what was he going to do about it? Amon had just resumed making his way toward home for a visit with Sarah when Ira sidled up next to him. He clapped Amon on the shoulder and asked, What did our high and mighty friend have to say? Amon made a sour face, both because of Abram's remarks as well as because of Ira's argument. He tried to be gracious, though, and he swallowed the impulse to say something rude. He seemed to think that you were advocating the destruction of all civilization and seeking to initiate a new era of darkness and destruction, Amon said. Ira laughed. He knows our plans only too well. If I have my way, one stone of the Temple of Nana will not be left on top of another. Amon shook his head. I haven't seen him take our little debates so much to heart before. Religious zealots always have a hard time countenancing any belief other than their own, Ira mused. Turning to meet Amon's eye, he asked, Are you on your way home? I am, Amon confirmed. Do you mind if I walk with you? Ira asked. I wanted to discuss something with you. If you like, Amon said hesitantly. He hoped Ira wouldn't accompany him all the way home. Iltani was not fond of visitors, especially if they were male. You seemed surprised at my argument in the debate tonight, Ira said. I suppose I was, Amon agreed. I hope it doesn't offend you for me to say it, but you are perhaps the least pious man I know. Ira laughed. Why should I be offended? I am proud of that fact. That is why I was surprised. To hear you champion the worship of a god, even so unconventional a one as Tiamat, it sounded odd coming from your lips, Amon pointed out. Not worship, Ira corrected. Use. They are not the same thing. Using a god or worshipping a god, whatever you call it, you seem to be seeking to control divine powers. I didn't think you believed in any, Amon said. How shall I explain it to you? Ira asked rhetorically. After a moment, Ira asked, Do you believe in this Lord of Light that Abram finds so fascinating? I neither believe nor disbelieve, Amon said. Each man may worship whatsoever god he will, it matters not to me. That is where you are wrong, Ira replied. They walked along in silence for a while. Ira was apparently trying to formulate his thoughts into an argument. As a merchant, you try to sell your wares to many different people, do you not? Ira asked. Certainly, Amon confirmed. And do you say the same thing to each and every person you are trying to convince to buy something? Ira queried. Of course not, Amon replied. To some customers, I sell the novelty of a thing, to another the rarity, and to a third its quality. Each man is different in what he values and enjoys. Exactly, Ira exclaimed. To a man such as myself who lives in a world of politics, power is the most important currency. You gain power over an individual man in much the same way as you sell him an olive. One man is greedy for shekels, another wants to be renowned, and a third has a weakness for women. By knowing their individual tastes, you can control them. I don't see where you are going with this, Amon said. Just as you control a man by knowing his desires, you can control him by knowing his religion, Ira continued. What does his god forbid? What does he permit? And which of the things his god forbids him does he secretly do? So, this interest you have in Tiamat is a means to an end? A way of gaining control and therefore power over men? Amon asked. I knew you would understand, Ira said. You are more clever than the others give you credit for. Amon, who understood nothing, didn't know what to do with either the compliment or Ira's line of reasoning. When he said nothing, Ira pushed on. In the temple, as in the palace, men are continuously looking for ways to expand their power and influence. In order to survive in that world, one needs to have friends whom he can trust, friends who are clever and reliable, and discreet, Ira said. Finally, Amon thought he could discern where this strange conversation was headed. You were looking for an agent, someone to help you weave your webs of power and deceit, Amon said. Such a person would stand to benefit from my contacts, Ira said. I know many people in positions of influence. A word in the right ear could open up fabulous opportunities. As my own influence grows, so will that of my friends. Amon was sure that Ira had spoken as plainly as he was going to, but he had no intention of getting himself enmeshed in petty court intrigues and the games of power his late friend Balashi had so often warned him against. Yet he had to be careful with his refusal. He knew that it might be dangerous to openly spurn the extended hand of friendship from an ambitious man such as Ira. Such men Amon had known in the past nursed grudges for a long time and took great pleasure in revenge. Amon was relieved to see that they had finally arrived at the gate to his home. I am flattered that you have thought to include me in your plans, Amon said. I will give your offer the serious consideration that it deserves, and I will let you know my decision when next we meet. Amon extended his hand, and Ira took it, but the man did not make to leave. "Friend Etana, might I intrude on your hospitality enough to ask you for a drink?" Ira requested. "My throat is dry from a long night of debate and our own little talk." Amon hesitated, but he could think of no way to graciously refuse the request. "Certainly, let me fetch it for you," Amon said. He opened the gate and stepped inside. Ira followed just behind. He motioned for Ira to have a seat in the courtyard, then headed toward the kitchen to fetch a drink for him. At the sound of the gate, Iltani's face appeared at the window from the kitchen which faced the courtyard. Opening the kitchen door, Amon made his way to the pantry and looked around for something Ira might like to drink. Iltani stepped beside him and looked at what he was getting from the pantry. "Why is there a strange man here inside the house?" she asked, with displeasure and a touch of fear. "I have a guest," Amon said. "A guest?" Iltani echoed. "He'll be gone soon enough," Amon said. Iltani followed him to the door and peeked from behind him into the courtyard. Amon took the jar and a cup, served Ira and exchanged a few pleasantries, then retreated back into the kitchen to return the cup and jar. "He does not look like a nice person," Iltani hissed at him. "Who, Ira?" Amon asked. "He's a friend, and a decent enough fellow." Amon left Iltani in the kitchen and returned to Ira's side, his mind working to come up with a way to induce him to leave. "Who is that lovely vision you were hiding away from me?" Ira asked Amon. "A member of my household," Amon said evasively as he walked toward the door to the road in order to try to get Ira to follow. "A servant, eh?" Ira said speculatively. "Better and better. You wouldn't mind loaning her to me for a few nights, would you? I promise to return her none the worse for wear. Well, not much worse, anyway." Ira grinned slyly, as if he was sharing a joke with a close friend. "She is my sister," Amon said stonily. "Isn't it time for you to leave? You don't want to be out and about after dark." "Ah, your sister," Ira replied, clearly not put off at all. "That requires a bit more tact, I suppose. Bring her to my house for dinner tomorrow night," he ordered. "What are you talking about?" Amon asked flatly, his hackles starting to rise at Ira's failure to take a hint, as well as the way he was treating Amon like his toady in an unsavory endeavor. "You do not see it because you are her brother," Ira continued. "But a woman such as that is always begging for it." "Begging for what, exactly?" Amon asked, his voice icy. "What I do to her," Ira continued, oblivious. "It isn't gentlemanly, I suppose, but—" Ira went on in a manner that was more graphic than anything Amon had ever heard from the basest man in the palace of Eridu. He was stunned at his friend's crudity. How dare this creature say such things in front of Amon in his own house about his sister? Amon struggled to control his temper, but lost. This was simply too much to be tolerated. "Your words and attitude both are foul and vile," Amon said in crisp tones made sharp by his fury. "If you utter another word in this vein, then our friendship is at an end. Leave now before I throw you in the cesspool like rotten garbage." Ira looked at Amon, shocked in his own turn. "Vile?" he repeated. "Foul? How dare you say that to me?" Amon turned red, his anger burning beyond his ability to keep it in any longer. Ira finally noticed and quickly stepped away. "I see you are upset," he said, his expression clearly conveying that he was disappointed and had expected an altogether different response from Amon. "I will take my leave." Ira scurried away, and Amon barred the gate with a clang. Amon tried to take pleasure in the simple play he engaged in with Sarah, but he found that the exchange with Ira had soured his mood. Iltani made a couple of timid attempts to engage him in conversation, but his monosyllabic replies and brusque manner quickly convinced her to retreat, her feelings clearly hurt. Back in the warehouse, Amon slept poorly. His quarrel with Ira and his poor treatment of Iltani both troubled his mind. What was he to do about the foul-mouthed cretin that he had thought of as his friend? He had been more than abrupt with him. He had threatened violence and been prepared to carry it out. He doubted that Ira would easily forget it. After the disturbing debate session, Ira's behavior was making him reconsider his participation in the group entirely. Was Abram right? Had he fallen in with a cell of worshippers of some black and mysterious foreign god? Amon tried to turn his mind to more pleasant things in order that sleep might overtake him. At least his business was really starting to flourish. He was very much looking forward to the upcoming caravan he had been planning for months to Uruk and Eridu. He and Namhu had sent messengers to one another several times in order to coordinate trade goods and their routes and dates, but it would be much better to see his old partner in person and to make plans for how they would expand their commercial interests. With Amon living in Ur, the range of trade goods available and the potential cities they could involve in their trade network had expanded considerably. The city's prime location near the confluence of both the Tigris and Euphrates, as well as its access to the nearby Gulf, which gave access to the lower sea, made Ur perhaps the most cosmopolitan and richest city in the world. Amon had ceased to be astonished whenever he came across some new thing he had never seen or experienced before in the markets of Ur. The people of Ur loved novelty, and both the river and sea traders were forever scouring the lands to which they traveled in search of new goods they might sell. These new things were unlikely to sell well in Eridu, where the people were so staid and conservative that any new thing was viewed with suspicion. But some of the gems and shells and other luxury items were sure to do well in Uruk, where vanity and display were a way of life. Amon hoped that the fresher seafood from Ur would do well enough in Eridu to allow him to make a profit, while the olives, oil, and other agricultural items he could get in Eridu always sold well in Uruk. Certainly Namhu had his finger on the pulse of trade in Uruk, but it was when he was selecting trade goods that Amon most keenly felt the lack of Aya's business acumen. Aya had developed almost a sixth sense of what would sell best where, and she had never been wrong in any of the caravans she had helped Amon to plan. In the morning, Amon and Ishtub-Sin oversaw the last-minute preparations for a couple of weeks of travel and trade. It was still scarcely mid-morning when they rolled out with several wagon loads of goods. They made their way to the docks, where they loaded a hired riverboat to take them against the current to the tiny town of Iranana, where he, Aya, and Iltani had made many friends in the short time they had stayed there after their flight from Uruk. Kugbao and his young wife welcomed Amon into their home for the 2 days it took Ishtub-Sin to sell their trade goods in Eridu. Amon himself had decided to remain as far from both Uruk and Eridu as he possibly could while still being available to personally oversee the details of the expedition. He had made too many enemies in both towns for him to risk his life with impunity by approaching too closely. But Ishtub-Sin was also fairly new to Amon's employment, and though he was older and more experienced in trade than Amon, still Amon didn't feel comfortable leaving the entire caravan in his unfamiliar hands. While Ishtub-Sin traded, Amon discussed with Kugbao the details of hiring workmen and bringing in raw materials to build a small dock in Iranana. He wasn't ready to commit yet, but if he were to have several successful caravans along this current route, both Amon personally and the entire tiny village of Iranana would benefit by the construction of a dock. Once their business concluded in Eridu, Amon, Ishtub-Sin, and the half-dozen caravan guards took their goods and pushed on to Uruk. After carefully offloading the delicate clay jars full of pickled olives, dates, and oil, Amon carefully picked through the other goods on the dock. There were all manner of wares that had come south from Kish, Akkad, and cities further north along the course of the Great River. There was a fine selection of leopard, lion, and other animal skins which Amon judged might sell well in Ur. When the proprietor of the skins, a fierce-looking man from beyond the Zagros Mountains with a great drooping mustache, dressed in tanned wolf hide with the hair still attached, saw Amon's interest, he came over. The two chatted amiably as they haggled, and when they at last settled on a price, the man shook Amon's hand. "The Lord of Light bless you and guide your path," he said. Something in that ritualized farewell caught Amon's attention. "Who is this Lord of Light you mentioned?" Amon asked. The man looked at him oddly. "How can you not know? There are but 2 gods in all of the wide world, the Lord of Light and the Lord of Darkness." "Only the 2? Amon pressed. The man looked at him even more strangely then. "The Lord of Light loves all things that burn brightly, the sun, fire, the truth. The Lord of Darkness loves chaos and lies." Amon tried to push the conversation further, but the man seemed to decide that Amon wasn't worth his time, or perhaps that he was mentally deranged, for he took his wares and walked away without looking back. Unfortunately, with the city of Uruk so nearby, there were neither houses nor taverns outside the city convenient to the docks, so Amon had to sleep on the riverboat. While he did not enjoy the constant susurration of the river waters against the hull, the gentle rocking of the boat eventually calmed him and allowed him to sleep. When Namhu came out from the city the next day, there was a great deal of backslapping and hugging and sharing of stories. Namhu had heard that Arya had passed away, and he gave Amon a gift of expensive incense to burn to Eresh Kigal to ensure Arya a peaceful stay in the underworld. Amon gave Namhu a silver bracelet encrusted with lapis lazuli and asked after his family. Namhu had taken 2 wives, one only a few months after the other. He had reasoned that with how much his business was prospering, he could afford to have a big family. He was now having occasion to regret his rash decision, as he had not had a moment's peace from the constant bickering, petty jealousies, and arguments. Namhu confided to Amon that if he had not had the calm of a good long caravan to look forward to, he probably would have already spoken to the father of his second wife about returning her to him. Amon commiserated about the difficulty of dealing with women for a while, and then the two of them got down to business. Amon's seafoods had not sold as well in Eridu as he had hoped, and he still had half his original cargo, which was rapidly approaching spoilage. Namhu had his men take the seafood to the cheapest of Uruk's 3 markets for rapid sale at a loss. The colourful stones and shells seemed much more promising, and these were taken to the temple market for sale in the booth of a jeweler Namhu had carefully been cultivating for months. Namhu and Amon compared the quality and skill evident in the construction of their various jars and pots, and then they came down to the conversation Amon had been dreading. "The jars you are making in Ur are of fair quality," Namhu conceded. "But if we are to become partners once more, it doesn't make sense for both of us to be producing pottery. My wares are of higher quality, and I have recently developed a new method for better controlling the temperature of the kilns. I have also found a new source for glaze that better protects the jars from scratching." Amon frowned. "What you say makes sense, but between caravans, the pottery business keeps my workmen occupied, and I turn a fair profit in Ur." "That suggests that the pots produced in my factory should sell well in Ur too," Namhu mused. "What if we were to increase the frequency of caravans beyond what we've planned in order to reduce downtime for your men? We would risk saturating the market and driving down prices," Amon cautioned. "Our customers will of course be composed of the wealthiest men in the cities, and their numbers are few. Besides the consumables such as olives and oil, we must constantly select new trade goods, for each nobleman will only purchase so much lapis lazuli or so many tortoise shells." "You could work on expanding the range of goods we carry," Namhu suggested. "We could sell things which would appeal to the artisans and craftsmen." Amon shook his head. "It is expensive to move goods up and down the river, even more so to move them over land. Cheaper goods are bulkier and heavier, so it won't be worth our while to move them from city to city. Workmen are unlikely to pay a premium for chairs produced in Uruk as opposed to chairs made locally." Namhu nodded, as if Amon had brought up something he hadn't considered, but of course he knew it all much better than Amon, for he came from a long line of merchants. "I wasn't suggesting chairs or any kind of furniture," Namhu said. "I was thinking that wealthy craftsmen love to imitate the styles of the elite. Perhaps a line of ersatz jewelry or clothes." When Amon failed to show any interest in that idea, he suggested, "We could always explore establishing caravans elsewhere." "Risky," Amon countered. "Soldiers, tax collectors, bandits, and kings are all eager to take advantage of outlanders to enrich themselves." "We would need to find new partners in any city to which we would like to expand," Namhu confirmed. "And we would have to be careful of unscrupulous partners who might try to steal from us." "Ur is full of people from all across the empire and beyond," Amon said. "Many of them will already have partners in Ur, but some of them will be unhappy with their current partners. There will be others who are not merchants at all, but who may have ambitious family members who might be willing to work hard to establish a profitable venture." Namhu nodded. "As you know, Uruk is similarly full of outlanders, though not so many as Ur. Here is what I propose. You will divest yourself of your pottery business and spend your time instead seeking out new partners and sources of new wares. You will identify a few leads for us to follow up, and you will travel with a small number of goods to trade and investigate whether or not we might be successful." Amon nodded. "That seems reasonable." "I will focus on making our pottery business run smoothly, but I will also ask my father to investigate the possibility of expanding northward," Namhu continued. "Perhaps Kish would make a sensible target. However, our main expansion should be southward, and our new trade goods should be sourced mainly from Ur. We will travel together on caravan at least 6 times each year, 10 if we can manage it, and we will split all profits equally." Amon smiled. "You are as generous and wise as ever, my friend. I look forward to a long and profitable relationship." "As do I," Namhu agreed. "I wonder if you would be willing to take on a couple of my potters, if they are of a mind to move to Uruk," Amon suggested. "Amalatu has had something of a checkered past, but he learnt the potter's art from his father when he was young, and now that he has turned his hand to it once more, his work is truly amazing. And Igmilam has done solid, dependable work for me from the day I hired him." Namhu rubbed his chin in thought. "What exactly do you mean by checkered past for this fellow Amalatu?" "Well, he has served as a mercenary in a number of different wars. He is scarred and a bit battered looking, but I thought that an asset rather than a liability. Amon explained. Because he could serve as both an artisan and a caravan guard at need? Namhu asked. Exactly, Amon confirmed. He is used to a much harder life than that of most artisans. He thinks nothing of sleeping out of doors and fighting off the occasional bandit. Very well, Namhu agreed. If you vouch for the quality of work and the honesty of these men, I will find them a place with me. Thank you, Amon said sincerely. I don't know if either one of them will want to relocate from Ur to Uruk, but it doesn't feel right to me to turn men out into the street without giving them options. Namhu smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. When we are done with our discussion, you should introduce these men to me, and I will speak with them. You have brought both of them along? When Amon confirmed this with a nod, Namhu clapped him again on the shoulder. You have not only a shrewd mind for business, but you also have a good heart. That is a rare thing to find among merchants. I am glad that you were able to extract yourself from the trouble you ran into in Eridu and Uruk. It does my heart good to see you healthy and happy. Now, did you bring along the special items I requested for my wives? Amon nodded. I hope these will meet with your approval, he said as he produced 2 matching strings of iridescent pearls from a supplier he had met who trafficked in them all across the lower sea. Namhu's eyes sparkled. They are exquisite, my friend. Your judgment is excellent, as it always has been. Namhu admired the pearls for a time, and then turned to Amon once more. What of you? He asked. Your wife has been gone for more than half a year. Are you mourning her still? Is there no one you have met who has caught your eye? Amon considered that. He hadn't felt romantic at all since Aya's death, but now that he considered it, it would make a nice gesture on his part if he got something nice for Iltani. It might help her to shake loose of the demon that tormented her if he reminded her of fond memories from the past. I suppose I could stand to take something nice to someone, Amon said to his friend. You remember Iltani, the former priestess of Inanna. She cares for my daughter now, and I am sure she would take it well if I bring her some token of my appreciation. I always used to bring her nice presents when I traveled on caravans in the past, and I suppose that I might find something to gladden her heart this time as well. Did you have something specific in mind? Namhu asked. Amon considered. I once gave her a small silver idol of Inanna. She had to leave it behind when we fled Uruk, but I am sure it would bring her a measure of joy if I replaced it with something a bit more sumptuous. Namhu smiled. Leave it to me, he said. When Amon arrived in Ur more than a week later, as soon as he saw Namhu well settled at his warehouse and the trade goods they had brought were all properly accounted for, he took a small satchel and went to his home. He presented the girls with the gifts he had brought for them. He had a shining, gem-encrusted idol for Iltani and a piece of sweet honeycomb for Sarah. In return, he received such a homecoming as he had not experienced for a very long time. Iltani exclaimed over her gift and gave him a warm and enthusiastic hug. It's just like the presents you used to give me back in Uruk, she exclaimed in delight. Sarah was somewhat more restrained, but she did smear a honeycomb-covered hand across half of Amon's face as she yelled, Da! 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 Amon took that as an indication that she was glad to see him too. Iltani made Amon sit down as she brought him a mug of warm tea. Then she asked him to tell her of his adventures. Mostly, it was very boring, he told her modestly. A lot of indistinguishable riverbank passing slowly by, followed by brief haggling over prices and seeing customers. Surely there was more to it than that, Iltani insisted. Amon thought for a moment to see if there was anything from his trip worthy of a story. There was this great hairy fellow I came across in Bad Tabira with huge mustaches that hung down to his chest, he said. I could scarcely understand him due to his thick accent. You know, I think he may have been a Hattian from the far north. I should have thought to ask him where he came from. Anyway, he was dressed in leathers from head to toe, and he smelled as if neither Skins nor owner had ever seen a bath in all of their lives. That explains the odor when you came in, Iltani teased. Amon lifted an arm and sniffed at his armpit, then dropped his arm quickly and made a face. Unfortunately, traveling in a caravan doesn't exactly accommodate close attention to personal hygiene, Amon said delicately. After I leave here, a bath will be the next order of business. Anyhow, the only thing I've ever come across that smelled worse than this fellow was his breath. He was constantly chewing some root or spice that turned his teeth red and made his breath smell exactly like a cesspit. Ew, Iltani said, wrinkling her nose. Don't worry, Amon said. I brought you some of the stuff to try. Great, I'll chew the whole lot and then give you a big fat juicy kiss, Iltani replied. A kiss, eh? I'll take it, Amon replied, puckering his lips and closing his eyes. Iltani lifted Sarah from off her lap and held the child's slobbery mouth up to Amon's lips. Thanks, Sarah, Amon enthused. If you were kissing like that now, I fear for the boys when you were older. Iltani laughed. I don't think you followed my reasoning for the route I brought. Amon said, picking up the thread of his story. I figured that anything that makes its user look like a bloody carnivore at its meal, and that smells so foul that no human being can stand downwind without risking death, must taste completely unbelievable. Sounds reasonable, Iltani agreed. So, how did it taste? She asked. Amon grinned. I would say it tasted about 1,000 times worse than it smelled. I immediately took the bit I had bought and sold it to some poor fellow as a repellent for mosquitoes. Did you really? Iltani asked skeptically. No, not really, Amon said. But I should have. I really just threw it in the river and killed the dozen fish and a crocodile with my carelessness. You will have to make a sacrifice to Enki to make up for polluting his waters so, Iltani chided. The funny thing is, Enki actually came to me and thanked me personally for throwing him the stuff, Amon said. Would you believe that gods grow sick of all that perfect divine food and drink that they have for every meal, and they begin to crave something really spectacularly horrendous from time to time? Iltani laughed a high, clear, silver bell laugh, and the sound of it warmed Amon's heart more than anything else. She looked at Amon, who was miming Enki eating something foul and truly enjoying it, and she laughed all the harder, doubling over with mirth and putting a hand on Amon's knee. After a few moments, she actually wiped tears from her eyes. Amon, she said as she tried to catch her breath. I haven't laughed like that in a very long time. Amon smiled. It does my heart good to hear it, he said simply. The rest of his visit was filled with warmth and yet more laughter, so that Amon felt as if he had truly come home for the first time since Arya had gone. Iltani was attentive and kind, and Amon thought back to the question Namhu had asked him and considered whether he hadn't been alone for long enough.